Hey, hello. Let's talk about when this all went to hell. Let's start with a chilly morning. Chilly for CalCell, anyway. It's my first morning back in Eagle Land in 3 months. In the early morning on the southwest coast, before the sun comes up, there's a mild and humid chill. I remember that I stepped outside of the hotel and sucked the air into my lungs. The air was thick, smelled like the beach. I loved it, especially after being away for so long. I was jet-lagged, my bags had been lost in transit, but I was back and the journey was nearly over. Overall, I was in a good mood. We arrived at the International CalCell Airport cargo building just as the top of the sun was cresting the clouds. I say we. A half an hour earlier, I had taken a taxi to a local moving and renovation company, to a place called Small Chuck's Big Men and Movers. The movers were big, and men. Truth in advertising, I guess, although I never saw Chuck, so who knows really. They'd come recommended from a client of mine in the area, a former client. I must have gotten two of Small Chuck's biggest. We jammed ourselves into the cab of a small moving truck. Must have been one of Chuck's trucks, I guess. The cab was far too small for the movers. As I mentioned, we had pulled into the cargo building's parking lot. The men stepped outside of the truck for a smoke. I was early and eager to start the loading process. Gotta show up early. I'd been doing this for several years by this time. There was always some unexpected issue that slowed things down. Through an open garage door, I walked into the cargo building office, which was little more than a patch of linoleum in a small warehouse. I looked around for someone to assist me. A sleepy guard sat slumped in a chair, arms folded. Behind a wood counter, a bookish clerk raised her eyes to see who had arrived. She slowly brushed the newspaper aside and greeted me. I said my good mornings, introduced myself, and I told her I was here to pick up an item. She got up out of her chair and pulled a small binder out from under her desk. She flipped through the pages and dragged her finger down to an entry. After a few seconds, she looked up and said, "I see. 1 crate, 78 pounds, D. Polvac." And, "Oh, this crate." I said, "Is something wrong?" She slapped the binder shut so hard I flinched. After a few seconds, she mumbled, "I don't think so, probably not." What does a response like "I don't think so" mean to a question like that? What do you do with that? And that's what I asked her. She said, "Look, buddy, it's none of my business, but..." She explained how 2 FBay agents had come in hours earlier to check the cargo. I asked for specifics and the guard stepped in. Those creeps was doing what they said was a secondary delivery point vermification. At that point, I wasn't worried. Should have been. But instead I was confused. What would the Federal Bureau of Art Enforcement want with this thing? And there's no such thing as a secondary verification or vermification. Like I said, I'd been doing this for years. Never heard of it. According to the clerk and the guard, 2 agents inspected the wooden crate, did some paperwork, and left. They asked no questions and hardly talked. I sighed and called out for the movers. Small Chuck's big men. We watched the duo lumber into the warehouse. The clerk folded her arms and told one of the men that smoking wasn't permitted here. He shrugged and said, "Fair enough." And he pulled the cigarette out of his mouth and ate it. To which the clerk mumbled, "Fair enough." She unhooked a rope gate and waved us to walk into the warehouse. I caught a glance at the headline on the newspaper that the clerk had been reading. It chilled me. I don't recall exactly what it said. Something about the growing turmoil in Pikelet. It was a large country neighboring Hengelicht, where I had just flown back from after a 3-month business trip. I'd seen some of the turmoil. Things weren't that good. And I know how it ended. We all know how it ended. But I fleshed it out of my head as we proceeded down one of the aisles. The clerk directed us to the crate. I gotta say, it looked more or less like it did when they loaded it onto the plane yesterday afternoon. There was a manila envelope stapled to the front. That was new. I plucked the manila envelope from the front of the panel and remarked aloud, "Creeps," which got an unexpected but welcome nod of affirmation from the clerk. I inspected the edges of the crate for any signs of having been opened. The nails looked untouched, no chipping around the edges of the wood, some mild wear, typical of being handled by the crew at CalCell Airport. There were stickers slapped onto the front with logistics information. Except for that manila envelope, though, nothing looked out of the ordinary. I gave the movers the okay, and they effortlessly hauled the crate back to the truck. We secured it, and were on our way. The movers were good company. The one in the passenger seat entertained us with stories of strange clients they'd met. The one behind the steering wheel would nod and grunt agreeably to anything anyone else said. I interjected with questions every now and then. Some of the wealthy of CalCell were eccentric folks. One of the stories was about a couple that was caught smuggling illegally acquired animal furniture. If any of it was true, it was some wild stuff. From what I can recall, there was an ottoman made out of a buffalo's head, a couch whose pillows were stuffed only with parrot feathers, and a rug made out of a mammoth hide. The talkative mover went on about someone who was recently busted for shipping stolen goods from overseas. And I guess he took my silence as a bad sign, or got nervous when he saw me finger through the documents that were contained in the manila envelope, because he said, "But that had never happened to you, bud." "Nah, we're straight," I chuckled. Still plenty of business for us on the up and up. Seemingly satisfied, he started going on about the turmoil overseas, which put a smile on his face somehow. The people over there weren't smiling. I thumbed through the pages. Most of them were copies of documents that I had signed at different points in the trip. The only document that I couldn't recognize was a form entitled Manual Proof of Receipt Dash, and then a long line that should have been filled in but wasn't. The rest of it was filled in, though, including 3 signatures at the bottom, an investigator and 2 witness agents. This was garbage. Well, I know that now. Most of the documents in the envelope were your standard FBA overhead, but this last document was news to me. Thoughts attempting to make sense of this nonsense ran through my brain. The crate didn't show any signs of having been opened. I was sure of it. And FBA had never inspected packaging on arrival, only on installation. And even that was uncommon. I promised myself that I'd check it again when we made it to the delivery site. Another in a long lineage of broken promises, like visiting my parents one last time before they died, or to comb my hair that morning before venturing out. Ava, sometimes I get the feeling that every big story in my life is just the end of another big story. This one follows that trend. It was hell going through it, but at least it's fun to tell. Well, later, Ava. Have a good evening. We'll pick it up tomorrow.